Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight, tensions in Ukraine. President Biden says he will soon send U.S. troops to Eastern Europe. Then, ballot battle. Texas' restrictive new voting law sparks confusion, forcing election officials to reject hundreds of applications for mail-in ballots.
Texas is already the hardest state to vote in the entire country, and this just turbocharges how hard it'll be.
And it's Friday. David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart consider the legacy of Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer and what his retirement could mean for the High Court. All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by Johnson & Johnson, financial services firm Raymond James,
the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, fostering informed and engaged communities. More at kf.org.
and with the ongoing support of these institutions. And friends of the NewsHour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
President Biden confirmed tonight that U.S. troops will be heading to Eastern Europe and NATO countries amid heightened tensions between Russia and Ukraine. He was asked by a reporter about any U.S. troop movements this evening.
Have you decided how soon you would be moving U.S. troops to Eastern Europe?
I'll be moving U.S. troops to Eastern Europe and the NATO countries in the near term.
Earlier today, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky downplayed fears of an imminent war between Ukraine and Russia, urging the West not to panic over the escalating situation at the border. Meanwhile, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that Moscow doesn't want a war, but he also warned the West not to trample on his country's security interests after the U.S. delivered its response to Russia on the Ukraine crisis.
We got the answers only the day before yesterday. They are written in Western style and make things as clear as mud in many aspects. But as I have said before, there are some rational kernels in there regarding peripheral issues.
Russia's President Vladimir Putin also spoke with French President Emmanuel Macron today and voiced his frustrations over his country's unmet demands. Nick Schifrin is here following all of these developments. So, hello, Nick. What President Biden had to say a few minutes ago caught our attention. Tell us what's behind these comments.
The U.S. has put 8,500 troops on heightened alert, prepare to deploy orders. That's what the Pentagon calls it. And the reason it's done that is it's concerned not only about war in Ukraine, about war in Ukraine spreading into Eastern Europe. And so it wants to reassure Eastern flank allies. It wants to reassure NATO. Part of that is giving U.S. troops over to NATO command to reinforce that eastern flank along the Russian border. And at the same time, NATO countries are trying to do the same, reinforce with French, with Dutch jets, with soldiers moving to Eastern Europe to really try and make the message to Putin clear that regardless of what happens in Ukraine, we are, we being the West, we being NATO, are able to deter you, are able to send you a message about how strong we feel about the number of troops that need to be in Eastern Europe and our commitment to defend our NATO allies.
So, Nick, we reported what the Ukrainian president is saying, telling the West not to panic, but the Pentagon had something to say today. Tell us about that.
Yeah, what's interesting here is the Pentagon, the U.S. and Kyiv really aren't on the same page when it comes to the threat. You know, from the U.S. perspective, they see Russian troops. They see Russian material rushing to the Ukrainian border every day. These videos released by the Russian military of defense every day. And what the U.S. sees is a more serious and imminent threat than Europe has seen in decades. As we heard today from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, in a joint Pentagon press conference with the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin.
Sure, with 100,000 troops, and you've got combined arms formations, ground maneuver, artillery, rockets, you got air, and all the other piece parts that go with it. There's a potential that they could launch on very, very little warning. That's possible. This is larger in scale and scope and the massing of forces than anything we have seen in recent memory, and I think you'd have to go back quite a while into the Cold War days to see something of this magnitude.
Now, just before that, we heard Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky say that talk of imminent war was causing panic in Ukraine, and he criticized the U.S. for making a decision last weekend for evacuating diplomatics' families, as we heard today through Zelensky's official interpreter.
Embassy employees should be here. These are the captains. I'm sorry, but this is the captains of the diplomatic corps. They're the representatives of their respective countries. And the captains are the last who should be leaving the ship. And I don't think we have a Titanic here. Ukraine is moving forward. Sometimes they're not even using diplomatic language. They're saying tomorrow is the war. This means panic on the market, panic in the financial sector.
Ukrainian officials tell me, Judy, that they believe the U.S. is actually hyping the threat, and that is leading international investors to refuse to lend to Ukraine, and that reduces Ukraine's economic growth. They also say that they're frustrated at their requests for more weapons. For example, Patriot missiles, like you can see there, anti-ship missiles are being denied by the administration. Now, senior U.S. officials tell me that they are sending a lot of weapons to Ukraine, and that they're frankly just calling it as they see it on the border with Russia. And that frank talk continued last night in the conversation between President Biden and President Zelensky. I'm told Biden told Zelensky that Russia has the capacity to seize and hold territory and even overthrow the government in Kyiv.
So, Nick, while all this is going on, is the diplomatic track still alive here?
Yes, very much so. Earlier this week, the U.S. and NATO gave official responses to Russia's demands, rejecting Russia's demands that Ukraine never join NATO, and that NATO roll back basically to 1990s levels. And instead, the U.S. wants to limit military exercises in Europe, restrict missile deployments, and talk about new arms control. Now, today, as you said, Judy, Vladimir Putin said the U.S. had, quote, failed to take Russian security concerns into account. But we heard something else from Sergei Lavrov. He said there was a kernel of rationality in the U.S. proposals, and that could be a hint that diplomacy will move forward. U.S. Naval War College Nicholas Gavoze told me earlier today.
What it means is that there are points at which Lavrov believes that he can continue negotiating directly with the United States, perhaps understanding that the U.S. can't make certain formal commitments, but you might be able to jury-rig a solution with the U.S. that Moscow might find satisfactory. And this is where another diplomatic track is going to be quite critical, and that is the revival of the Normandy format with Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia.
That Normandy format focuses on the war that is ongoing, Judy, in eastern Ukraine and requires Moscow to reduce violence, but it also requires Kyiv to give areas that are controlled by Russian separatists some autonomy. And those talks will continue over the next couple weeks.
All right, Nick Schifrin following developments from every front tonight. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
In the day's other news, an investigation is underway tonight to determine what caused a Pittsburgh bridge to collapse into a ravine hours before President Biden visited the city to tout the new bipartisan infrastructure law. Several vehicles, including a bus, were on the 50-year-old bridge when it caved in early this morning. Pittsburgh mayor said there were a handful of injuries.
I think 10 have been seen and they're okay. So we're just going to continue to hope for the best and make sure that we get this together. Right now, we're still assessing the situation, getting information. But the good thing at this point is that there's no fatalities.
Mr. Biden stopped by the site of the collapse before his speech. He thanked first responders and surveyed the damage from behind a concrete barrier. Later, he vowed to fix the nation's aging infrastructure.
This is the first time in the country's history that we dedicated national program to repair and upgrade bridges. It's about time. We're going to rebuild that bridge, along with thousands of other bridges in Pennsylvania and across the country.
The new infrastructure law has earmarked more than $1.5 billion for repairing bridges in Pennsylvania alone. On Wall Street, in a turnaround, stocks notched their best day of this new year after a roller coaster week of trading. The Dow Jones Industrial Average soared 564 points to close at 34,725. The Nasdaq gained 418 points, and the S&P 500 added 105. In other economic news, a key measure of inflation, a key measure of inflation rose 5.8% last year, the steepest increase since 1982. And consumer spending fell more than 0.5% in December. COVID-19 cases have fallen 27% in the U.S. over the past 2 weeks, while the average number of new deaths rose 34%. 10 billion COVID vaccine doses have now also been administered globally, but fewer than 1 in 10 people in low-income countries have received one. Blizzard warnings are in effect along the east coast of the U.S. tonight ahead of a major winter storm. Conditions are expected to worsen as the storm moves across the northeast tomorrow, dumping as much as 3 feet of snow on parts of New England. Boston is bracing for what could be its worst snowstorm in 4 years. Mayor Michelle Wu urged people to stay home.
This has the potential to be a historic storm, a huge one. The National Weather Service has already issued a blizzard warning for Boston. This is likely to be an intense, dangerous storm with heavy snow, high winds, and whiteout conditions.
The snow is expected to continue through Sunday. Meanwhile, a severe tropical storm in eastern and southern Africa has killed at least 88 people since it made landfall Monday. It flooded parts of Madagascar before hitting Mozambique and Malawi, where it destroyed homes and washed away bridges. Another storm in the Indian Ocean is expected to strike the same region this weekend. More than a third of the people in Ethiopia's war-torn Tigray region are suffering from an extreme lack of food. That is according to a new report from the United Nations World Food Program. The UN also said Tigray has not received humanitarian aid since mid-December. And on a lighter note, there is a new pet at the White House, a 2-year-old farm cat named Willow. She was named after First Lady Jill Biden's hometown of Willow Grove, Pennsylvania. Willow joins Commander, the first family's German Shepherd puppy introduced in December. So there's something for both dog and cat lovers. Still to come on the NewsHour, Olympic skier Lindsey Vonn discusses the upcoming Winter Games and her new book. David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart weigh in on Justice Breyer's retirement and more. A new TV series explores the cultural ramifications of Bill Cosby's downfall, plus much more.
This is the PBS NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
President Biden has made tackling climate change a central piece of his agenda. He's secured more money for renewable energy and proposed tougher regulations on carbon and methane emissions. But it has been a more complicated story when it comes to drilling for oil and gas. William Brangham looks at how that's playing out.
Judy, early on, President Biden halted any new oil and gas leases on public lands, but a federal judge blocked that move. Since then, the administration has been issuing permits, even exceeding what President Trump did. That includes the largest sale of oil and gas leases in history for drilling on 80 million acres in the Gulf of Mexico. But yesterday, a different judge blocked that, saying the government didn't adequately consider what impact that drilling would have on climate change. To help us sort through all of this, I'm joined by Lisa Friedman of the New York Times. Lisa, great to have you back on the NewsHour. So this judge said to the administration, before you grant these leases, you have to acknowledge and look more closely at what impact that has on climate change. I mean, that's the argument that environmentalists have been making for years, that you have to weigh these projects against the pollution they'll create. But how common is it for a judge to actually make that argument?
Well, thank you. And it is increasingly common. Just to back up a moment, because this case is nothing if not complicated. The Biden administration last year was told by a judge that it must go forward, despite its promises to end new leasing, that it must go forward with this lease sale in the Gulf of Mexico that had been set by the Trump administration. The administration did. It was the largest lease sale in U.S. history, about 80 million acres, 1.7 million of which were purchased approximately. And this judge has now said to the administration, the analysis that you did, which is in fact a Trump administration analysis, really was not robust enough when it came to climate change. That's something that we're hearing from judges more and more.
I mean, as we were saying, this is all part of this central dilemma that the Biden administration has these grand ambitions, but it comes up against both the domestic energy needs that these leases might help fulfill, plus these very tricky legal realities. So what is your sense, though? Does this ruling change in some fundamental way how we grant leases going forward?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think one thing that I've found today in discussing this with experts is that, as you pointed out in the beginning of the segment, we are seeing judges. We saw a judge in the Ninth Circuit last year, a recent case in Alaska, saying, hey, administration, whether it's Trump or Biden, we really need to see a much more robust analysis of the impacts of climate change. So I think what we're going to see in the future is that no administration will be able to downplay or hide the impacts that the burning of the fossil fuels developed in these leases will have. That doesn't necessarily mean these lease sales won't go forward in the future, but there will be a much more transparent, I believe, and I think experts believe, detailing of the impacts.
Lisa, what has the environmental movement's reaction been to this, both to this ruling and to the way in which the Biden administration has, somewhat surprisingly, granted a lot of these leases?
This decision was a huge win for environmental groups. There is a mixed attitude toward the Biden administration, I would say, in the environmental community. There's no doubt that the Biden administration has made climate change a front and center issue. On the other hand, there have also been things that have really disappointed the environmental community. Not long after returning from Glasgow last year, where President Biden told the world to reduce fossil fuel emissions, the U.S. went forward with this lease sale. There's also been disappointments on the administration's position around pipelines, but I think going forward on this lease sale was probably the biggest concern that groups had last year, and they've been vindicated now by this federal judge.
All right, Lisa Friedman of the New York Times, good to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Later in this midterm election year, voters in 19 states will head to the polls with new, more restrictive voting laws on the books. One of those states is Texas, where the party primaries are just a few weeks away. Some voters and election workers say one provision in the new law in the Lone Star State is already causing confusion. Jeff Bennett has our report.
In Texas, election workers are reporting that hundreds of applications for mail-in ballots are being rejected, one of the early effects of the state's new Republican-backed voting law. It requires that voters provide either a partial Social Security number or a driver's license number on their ballot application, and that number has to match what's on their original voter registration. The problem is, most people don't remember what form of ID they initially provided, especially older voters who registered decades ago. And that's not the only thing causing confusion, says Jessica Huseman, editorial director of VoteBeat.
People aren't used to filling out the new forms and they fill out incorrectly. And then there is also a problem where the voter roll in Texas is missing some information from voters. So if they write down the incorrect number that is missing by accident, or because they don't know which one is in the system or that one is missing, then their registration will be automatically rejected.
A problem, she says, which could have been prevented.
We pointed this problem out initially in July of last year, which was well before this law passed. And so there was an opportunity for Texas lawmakers to address the issue.
James Slattery with the Texas Civil Rights Project warned members of the Texas House in testimony last summer.
It is easy to see the needless chaos and mass disenfranchisement that requiring this matching process will create.
Slattery sees it as another barrier to the ballot.
Texas is already the hardest state to vote in the entire country, and this just turbocharges how hard it'll be. These new vote by mail requirements, though, will particularly impact certain groups of Texans, because only certain groups of Texans right now even have the right to vote by mail. So in particular, people who are 65 and older have the right to vote by mail in Texas and use it in large numbers. So do people who are disabled. And so are people who are temporarily away from home during the voting period.
Is this voter suppression by design, or is this just benign negligence on the part of lawmakers who failed to heed warnings from folks like yourself?
It's hard not to see this as a feature rather than a bug. There is, I think an element of bureaucratic malpractice here too, just because the state's election infrastructure is so underfunded already that when you put a new 76-page bill on top of it, it's going to be bad regardless.
Election integrity is now law.
In September, Texas Republican Governor Greg Abbott signed a slew of voting restrictions into law, one of many efforts in Republican-controlled states to enact new limits after former President Donald Trump pushed the debunked myth of voter fraud in the 2020 election. The U.S. Justice Department has since sued Texas over the law, arguing that it disenfranchises voters. Texas Republican lawmakers say the voting law, known as SB 1, is aimed at increasing public trust in state elections.
Senate Bill 1 makes it easy to vote and hard to cheat.
We tried to speak with Texas State Senator Brian Hughes and State Rep Andrew Murr, who wrote the legislation.
The legislative intent that we talk about.
But both Republicans denied our interview requests.
It's not just voters who are frustrated by this new process. It's also election workers who are frustrated that they can't help voters fix their applications because the law now prohibits them from doing so.
Absolutely. And I think we've seen that pretty open annoyance by the local clerk's office with the Texas Secretary of State's office over this issue.
Dana DeBeauvoir is the Travis County clerk. She served in county government for 40 years.
In so many ways, we can't even practice free speech with voters. You can't call them back to cure a problem with their application or their ballot because that's seen as promoting by-mail voting, when all we really want to do is figure out what their new correct identification number should be. Just to be passively helpful with voters, we shouldn't be so hamstrung in that sense.
A violation carries a mandatory minimum of 6 months imprisonment and a fine of up to $10,000.
This is voter suppression. So I'm very concerned about our democracy. I'm concerned about why the legislature wanted to stop all voters, including their own Republican voters, from voting by mail.
Across the state, from Houston to San Antonio to Austin, the law has caused a spike in rejections in mail ballot applications. Travis County, home to Austin, normally rejects 1% to 2% of ballot applications. Currently, officials say it's about 6 to 7%. In Harris County, which includes Houston, about a third of rejected applications were tossed because of ID problems.
I've never missed a vote.
That includes this 95-year-old World War II veteran who says his mail-in ballot application has been denied twice due to new requirements.
There's just no point in taking a fully qualified, eligible voter and rejecting them. Or maybe what we really do know what the point is, and that is to suppress them.
What should voters do in the meantime?
Well, you've asked a very good question, because I can't tell voters directly what to do to cure their by-mail ballot, because that is seen as promoting by-mail voting, and I am in danger of a state jail felony. Now, what other people, friends, the media, everybody else can and is saying, the cure for that kind of a problem is to include both numbers on the application. the last 4 digits of your social security number and your driver's license number. You heard that from everybody except me, the election official.
She's urging those affected by the new mail ballot application process to not let it stop them from voting. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jeff Bennett.
And that brings us to the analysis of Brooks and Capehart. That is New York Times columnist David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, columnist for the Washington Post. Hello to both of you on this Friday night. David, I know you two were listening, watching Jeff Bennett's report. What do you make of what's happened in Texas in the aftermath of their tightening of election laws?
I think it's really important to send election clerks to jail for 6 months. I mean, that part of the bill strikes me as completely crazy. The overall principle of the thing that you should have voter ID in person or by mail, that doesn't strike me as crazy. That strikes me as something 80% of Americans support. It strikes me as something that happens in countries all around the world. Germany, France, Israel, democracies all around the world have voter ID. And so you would like to think it's just incompetence that as of, I think, last summer, there were 2 million registered voters who did not have the proper numbers on the voter rolls. And so when they sent in their applications for mail, it came back rejected. And so that's just bureaucratic incompetence, something I think they're trying to fix. But the question is this suppression, which we've just heard answered twice, and given the law about the clerks, you'd have to think there's some nefarious motives going on here.
Jonathan, nefarious motive?
Yes, I agree 100% with David. Look, one of the people in that great segment from Jeff Bennett was where he said, it seems like this is more of a feature than it is a bug. And when the right to vote should be something that should be as easy as possible. The obstacles and the barriers to exercise the franchise should be as few and as low as possible. And when you are now threatening poll workers, who, as Ms. de Beauvoir said, all she wants to do is help people cure their ballots and be able to exercise their right to vote. And yet she's threatened with jail. But I love that she, gave advice without jeopardizing herself. What is happening in Texas, what is happening in Georgia, what is happening in Arizona and other states is happening because the governors and the legislatures in those states don't want their citizens to vote, and they don't want particular citizens to vote. I mean, what else are you supposed to think when in Texas, for example, you can use your gun license as ID to prove your ID, but you can't use your university or college ID? What does that say to a potential young voter who wants to vote? And so, I think the nation's eyes are focused right now on the right to vote and the ability to vote. And it's going to take everyone who is concerned about this to push for remedies to keep these things from happening. And that's why it is very important that the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act somehow get out of their purgatory and get passed and become law.
And we'll be watching to see if these kinds of things happen in other states. As we said, 19 states have passed new restrictive voter legislation. I do want to ask you both about one of the big news headlines this week, David, and that was the announcement by Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer that he is going to step down from the court, retire after almost 28 years. He's going to do so at the end of this term. Before we talk about what for the future of the court, what is your sense on what his presence on the bench has meant to the country, to the court, for these last few decades?
Yeah, two things. One, he just has an extraordinary mind. I was once at a conference that we were at, a small conference, and I was giving some presentation, and somewhere in the presentation I said, here's a problem. I don't really know the answer to the problem, but here's a problem, and I can't remember what the problem was. So after the session, he comes up to me with a piece of paper, Justice Breyer, and he says, I don't know the answer to that problem either, but here's how you might think about it. And it was this diagram of how you think this, if then this, then this, and filled the whole page. I've never seen anything like it in my life. So I thought, wow, this guy knows how to think. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is just how public spirited he was in the way he did things. There's been a controversy this week over whether he was too naive, whether he should understand that we're not in a time where we can have compromise, we can stick to facts. We're in a time of bad faith, it's just a brutal war. And some people have accused him of being naive to that fact and trying to be too reasonable. But I would say, A, I don't think Justice Breyer has any choice but to be reasonable. And B, even in the midst of a war, I think it's still important for reasonable people to be reasonable and to try to seek compromise, to try to seek consensus, to try to seek use reason in a prudent way and not in a bellicose way. And he embodied that throughout his whole career.
Jonathan, he was a believer in trying to get the justices to come together on some of these most important cases.
Right, and that is what the court is going to lose when he retires. The court's going to lose a thinker. One of the things about Justice Breyer, especially in the profiles that I read, is his questions could go on and on and on, that he would sort of think out loud as he was trying to figure out what he should think or test out his theories with the opposing lawyer. But what that said to me was that here's a thinker who was open. Here was a thinker who really wanted to debate and think through the issues in the way that David saw with his own eyes, with that diagram that he put out there. But the other thing that strikes me about Justice Breyer is the pragmatism. Yes, he is known for being with the left, the liberal wing of the Supreme Court, but pragmatists are people who compromise. They are about bringing all the sides together and coming to some kind of understanding. And usually compromise is for the greater good, is for something bigger than his own beliefs, but is something that is for the greater good of either the court as an institution or the country as a whole. And it is my hope, and I really hope that whoever President Biden chooses to be the nominee is someone who will be pragmatic. And I'll just, say flat out, since we know that it is going to be a Black woman who will be the nominee and hopefully confirmed as the justice, I can tell you right now, there's no more pragmatic people in the world out of necessity than a Black woman.
David, what do you make of the president's pledge? He's made it first during the campaign. He repeated it this week. He said, I'm going to be naming, he said, the most qualified person, and it is going to be a Black woman judge, the White House said.
Yeah, I want the court, like every institution in American life, to look like America. We've learned, and I think all known how important it is to have people from different backgrounds, because we're not just machines who think. We come from a certain background. We're formed by certain values and experiences. So it's important to have that diversity. Nonetheless, I confess I'm a little uncomfortable at fronting that identity, putting that identity up front. And I think universities have learned that as they seek diversity, they should treat the whole person. And so naming it that way and putting those identity issues up front, to me, it's a matter of articulation. But I would like to emphasize, I would like to think the part of the person that's up front is their wisdom, their compassion, their care, and that they are treated as a whole person. And so I confess I'm a little uncomfortable with the way Joe Biden used that pledge during the campaign, though I support the idea of the pledge.
Jonathan, would it be better for the president to have said the first thing that matters is wisdom?
Well, that's what he said in his remarks yesterday. We have to understand something, that for far too long in this country, qualifications and wisdom and everything were never things that were, or ideas or characteristics that were automatically ascribed to someone who was not white, and certainly someone who was not white and male. And, we have seen on the court that, diversity has not been a thing on the court. Up until recently, we have an African-American justice, we have several women justices, we have a Latina justice, and pretty soon we will have a Black woman justice. and it says something. You can focus on the race, but how about we focus on the experience the person brings to the bench because of who they are, where they're from, their lived experience. And also, the Black woman who's going to be on the bench will probably be more impressive, have more qualifications, be more brilliant than the folks who have come in before her, precisely because she has had to be all those things, because people used her race to downgrade and downgrade and belittle and not think much of her simply because she is Black.
What about that, David?
Yeah, well, first of all, I probably agree with that. We'll see when the person's named. I've read some of the likely candidates, and they do seem extremely impressive. I guess I think the history of America is a history of racial essentialism. It's a history of judging people by what group they're part of and by what skin color. And that's an ugly, awful history. And I guess the question for me is, how do we best overcome that history? It involves, A, recognizing race is a real thing, that racial injustice is a real thing, but it also involves trying not to essentialize people, trying not to reduce them to categories. And to me, sometimes the way it was articulated during the campaign, as I say, it put that level of identity first. I'd like to think he would just pick the best person and who would be a Black woman. But when you put that identity first, I think you're in danger in a culture that is racial essentializing more and more these days. I think you're in danger of feeding into that.
Another thought on this, Jonathan?
I mean, I just disagree. I think as someone who is Black, the idea that you have a potential president of the United States and now a president of the United States who says that he wants to put someone on the bench who looks like you, to me says he is recognizing that I and we are a part of this country, an integral part of this country, that there have been millions of people who, because of their race, were denied even consideration for being on the bench. And so I am not going to criticize the president at all for saying he wants to put a Black woman on the bench, because one, it is something that should have been done a long time ago, but two, the person he does nominate, we all know from jump that that person is more than qualified, is more than worthy, and is more than able to sit on the bench, and hopefully for more than 28 years.
So important to hear what both of you think about this. Jonathan Capehart, David Brooks, thank you both.
Thanks, Judy.
One week from today, the Winter Olympics get underway in China. I talked about the upcoming games and her new book yesterday with Lindsey Vonn, the Olympic gold medal winning alpine skier. She holds 4 overall World Cup titles and is one of only 6 women to have won World Cup races in all 5 disciplines of alpine skiing. She retired in 2019 and is out now with a new memoir, Rise, My Story, which focuses on her trailblazing career. Lindsey Vonn, welcome to the NewsHour. Congratulations on the book. So much of your story begins with your family, how they've supported you throughout your career. You write so much about your father, how he encouraged you. He was a former serious skier himself. But I saw in the beginning of the book, you dedicate this book to your mother, and you say she was your inspiration. How so?
Well, my mother actually had a stroke while giving birth to me. And, she's been so optimistic and positive my entire life. And I think that's where I've gotten that optimism from. Whenever I've faced adversity, especially physical injury in the course of my career, I always look to my mom for, that level of optimism and positivity and also just a different perspective. My mom had a limp because of her stroke, and she was never able to bike or run or ski with me. And so I just think, I can come back from my injuries and my mother cannot. So it's a privilege for me to be able to work hard and come back, and just, I don't know, having that perspective changed the way I approached injuries and the way I approach adversity. And that's why I dedicated the book to my mother.
Well, what also definitely comes through in this book is your drive, your determination to reach your goal. I mean, I know you've been asked this question so many times, but where does that come from? At 7 years old, you were saying you wanted to be a skier. When you were just 9, you said you were going to the Olympics. Where do you think it comes from?
I've always been a very driven person, but I think it also comes from my environment, my family, my parents, my grandparents. My grandfather was a very tough, strong man who had an incredible work ethic, as was my grandmother. And I'm spending a lot of time as a kid around them. And also, again, my mother being extremely tough, and my father, really ingraining in me work ethic. And I think that all of those people really shaped me. But the drive to want to be the best and to be a competitor, I don't know, that's something that I've always had.
And Lindsey Vonn, you also write in detail about the physical injuries you've experienced over your career and how you powered through them and came back. You pushed yourself to the extreme. And as you think back on that, do you have any second thoughts about it? Because some of these injuries might have been life-threatening.
I think, unfortunately or fortunately, that's just the risk that we take in ski racing, and I've always known that risk. So I always have thought it's been worth it. I love ski racing. I love the adrenaline and the thrill, and going down a mountain at 85 miles an hour. I think there's really nothing quite like it. Have I paid a heavy price for doing what I love? Absolutely. I'm in pain pretty much every day. My knees are always hurting me. My arm hurts. Everything is, but everything hurts. But you know what? I was happy that I was able to get as many years out of it as I did, and to have the success that I did. I feel very lucky.
Well, in connection with that, you're also candid in the book about the emotional stresses that you've been under. You've talked for some years publicly about dealing with depression, but now we seem to be going through a period where more athletes are being more open to talk about their struggles. Do you think we're turning a corner in that way, or do you think there's still just a lot of stigma associated with it?
I still think there's a lot of stigma, but I mean, I started talking about it in 2012, and the stigma was much greater then than it is now. I mean, it wasn't an easy thing for me to talk about at that time, and many people said that it was going to ruin my career. But thankfully it didn't. And, thankfully we're continuing to have these conversations. And I think, with people like Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka and, Michael Phelps and Kevin Love, athletes speaking out about mental health only can be positive, because it sheds light on a topic that, again, has a lot of stigma attached to it. And hopefully we can change that and empower others to seek help and get the support that they need.
One other thing you write about is how women are treated differently from men in athletics. What needs to happen, in your view, for there to be a more even playing field?
I can't tell you how many people said that I got sponsors, or I got certain privileges in my career because of my look, instead of my wins. And I think that's completely absurd. I've won 82 World Cups, and I have many Olympic and World Championship medals, and that's why I was able to get the things that I did, not because of the way I look. And that would never be even a remote point of conversation if I was a man. So I think just those generalizations and that type of conversation just needs to change, period.
A lot of work still to be done. I want to ask you about the Olympics this year, the Winter Games in China. As you know, a lot of conversation about whether they should even be being held there, given China's human rights record. The skier Mikaela Shiffrin said she had given it thought to whether she should go. Do you think if you were still competing, it would be giving you concern or pause?
I mean, it definitely is something that you need to think about as an athlete. I think that once the decision is made to have the Olympics at that venue, I think as an athlete, you can't say no. I mean, we worked our entire lives for those moments, and I think there's very few people that would turn that opportunity down. But I think going forward, it's really the conversation needs to be on how are we selecting these venues, what's the reason, and really making sure we don't come into situations where there's a lot of controversy.
Of course, there's a lot of conversation about how different these Olympics are. There's COVID to deal with, but there's also the growing conversation about climate change. They're having to make the snow for competition in Beijing. You've started to speak out yourself about climate change, the effect on skiing's effect on climate change. How do you look at that right now? And do you think it's something that there needs to be more discussion about?
I think a lot of athletes, especially skiers and winter athletes, have been talking about climate change for a long time. It just hasn't really been this dire until recently. But we've seen firsthand. I mean, I skied on glaciers in Austria since I was 9, and they basically no longer exist. They've melted that much. So, I think just because we're in winter all the time, we see the changes and the inconsistencies, and it's raining instead of snowing, and there's so much volatility in the climate right now that it's very apparent to us. I'm glad that we're having these conversations, and I hope that we can make enough change as a whole to be able to offset this climate change.
Well, the book we are so delighted to talk to you about it. The book is Rise, My Story. Lindsey Vonn, we thank you and we wish you the best.
Thank you so much. Take care.
In 2018, comedian Bill Cosby was convicted of sexual assault and given a 3 to 10-year prison sentence. Last year, that conviction was overturned by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which ruled that prosecutors had improperly used an earlier deposition by Cosby in which he admitted to drugging women. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court said he had done so in a civil lawsuit with an agreement that he would not face criminal charges. Now, a new documentary series looks at Cosby, the allegations against him, and his role as a major figure in American cultural history. Jeffrey Brown has the story for our Arts and Culture series, Canvas.
We thought we knew Cosby. We never knew Cosby.
We need to talk about Cosby. It's the name of a new 4-part documentary series that premiered recently at Sundance and begins this weekend on Showtime. For director W. Kamau Bell, the title expresses the urgency and importance of the subject.
For me, it's like he was a transformative cultural icon. There's very few people on the planet who've ever gotten more famous than Bill Cosby. So he was a big figure, so I think we can ask some big questions. Does it make you uncomfortable that I'm black?
As a stand-up comedian and host of the CNN series United Shades of America, Bell is used to addressing race and other big issues in his work.
Bill Cosby had been one of my heroes. I'm a black man, stand-up comic. I was born in the 70s. But this?
More trouble for Bill Cosby.
The accusations just keep coming in.
This was complicated.
In the new series, it's also personal for a 48-year-old who grew up watching Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids and then The Cosby Show.
I was born into a world where Bill Cosby was a part of the wallpaper of Black America.
You say in this, you're a child of Cosby.
Yes, that's the way I put it, because I was like, how do you describe that relationship? When I watched The Cosby Show, I felt like I was right there in there with the family. And then to become a stand-up comedian, in large part because of his inspiration, to try to do good in my career because I saw him doing good in his career through philanthropy and his example, I was as confused as everybody else when all these stories came out.
In We Need to Talk About Cosby, Bell gets people to do just that. Try to make sense of Cosby's game-changing place in American popular culture as comedian, actor, educator, philanthropist, role model. but all set against, at every point, the horrific acts detailed here. He interviews people who knew or worked with Cosby, other comedians, sociologists and writers on popular culture, experts on sexual violence.
Tell anyone this story?
Never told anybody.
And at length to women who tell their stories of betrayal and violation, with chilling similarity, often involving being unknowingly drugged.
When I first started looking into this, I didn't know nearly enough about this, and I think that's another thing we're trying to do is show people, like, you may think you know this story, even if you are a supporter of him or you're somebody who was a supporter of the survivors, you may think you know this story, but there's probably a lot you don't know. I didn't realize they went back so far into almost the early days, to not the first beginning of his career, but like very early in his career, that these allegations went back that far.
Over time, some 60 women have come forward, though Cosby only ever faced the one criminal trial that led to the 2018 conviction that was later overturned. Cosby has consistently publicly denied all accusations. And this week, a spokesman denounced Bell's documentary, saying in part, "Let's talk about Bill Cosby. Mr. Cosby has spent more than 50 years standing with the excluded, made it possible for some to be included, standing with the disenfranchised." Mr. Cosby vehemently denies all allegations waged against him. He wants our nation to be what it proclaims itself to be, a democracy. There are people, of course, who still support him, who still believe him. You have no doubts.
I have no doubts, and I'm hearing from those people on all my social media platforms.
And what do you say to them?
I think I'm engaging with it and talking to them through this project. I feel like a lot of people who are going to hate this will never watch it, which I understand. But I feel like if you watch it, you'll see that I think there's a worry that I'm destroying his legacy, and I think this is the only way you can actually approach the legacy of his good work is if you have the whole conversation.
The reality is he needed to go to prison. He's a criminal. But was I at home cheering? No, I was like, this is one of the worst. This is just a sad day in the history of Black culture.
Bell makes clear this is an especially fraught conversation in the Black community. On the one hand, Cosby, known as America's dad, was beloved.
America's dad, not Black America's dad, but America's dad. But Black people always knew we've been down for this guy since before the Cosby Show, so he's still ours. White people can enjoy it, but this is for Black people. And the fact the show was aspirational. It didn't reflect the average Black family, but as I say in the doc, I don't care. It was aspirational, so you felt like it was sort of like helping you believe in a life that you might be able to get to.
But Cosby also became a divisive figure beginning in 2004 when he began to speak out critically of what he saw as irresponsible behavior, including language, clothing, and a prevalence of single-parent families, in what many took as a moralizing tone. All of this, Bell says, plus the history of racist, false accusations against Black men, played into the story.
The whole thing is like this is a third rail conversation maybe for every American who grew up with Bill Cosby in their life, but for Black people, it's like we keep adding more electrified rails to the conversation, because it's just there's also this thing about not wanting to tear down any Black person in public and not airing dirty laundry. And and even not why don't I do this on a Black network, or these things, the questions of like where it is appropriate. So it's a complicated, divisive conversation on its best day.
There's also a larger indictment here of a society that Bell sees as too often complicit in violence against women.
We have to be able to learn something from this situation, and like I said, it's bigger than Cosby. We need to create a country where survivors of sexual assault and rape not only feel like they can speak up, but they want to speak up because they know they live in a society that is supportive and will help heal them and help them seek justice.
The very first question in this is, who is Bill Cosby now? You're asking others. What's your answer?
The answer that makes the most sense to me is one that Kieran Amayo gives at the end. She was the ex-editor-in-chief of Ebony magazine. And there's something to the effect of Bill Cosby could be key in understanding America. And so for me, that's why this is worth talking about. Like, Bill Cosby is like the catalyst to understanding this American experiment in many ways, through the lens of racism and through the lens of sexism, misogyny, rape culture. He could be the key to helping us see, diagnose, and hopefully solve those problems.
That's asking a lot.
For sure. But don't we have to ask a lot? Aren't those problems big enough to ask a lot?
We Need to Talk About Cosby begins Sunday on Showtime. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jeffrey Brown in New York.
And on the NewsHour online, with space exploration rapidly changing, our digital anchor, Nicole Ellis, caught up with former NASA astronaut and physician Robert Satcher to discuss how many new aerospace technologies can be used here on Earth. That's on our website, pbs.org/newshour. And that's the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. Join us online and again here on Monday evening. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you. Please stay safe, and we'll see you soon.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by Consumer Cellular, Johnson & Johnson, financial services firm Raymond James, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, for more than 50 years advancing ideas and supporting institutions to promote a better world at hewlett.org.
Supporting social entrepreneurs and their solutions to the world's most pressing problems. SkollFoundation.org.
And with the ongoing support of these institutions. And friends of the NewsHour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.